Hello, my name is Antonio Capulera, and welcome to Capulera Studios. This is a place where imagination slows down and where colors begin as ideas, and where characters that once lived only in the stories slowly begin to appear on the canvas. Now, today we're stepping into three very different worlds: the mischievous charm of Captain Jack Sparrow, the timeless glamour of Jessica Rabbit, and the mysterious depth of Davy Jones. Three characters, three personalities, three very different energies. But when an artist begins to paint, something interesting happens. These characters stop belonging only to the movies we remember. They begin to live again through the hands of the artist. One brush stroke becomes a gesture, a shadow becomes a thought, and a color becomes a feeling. And slowly, the imagination begins to reveal itself. Walt Disney once asked several artists to paint the same tree. Every tree was different, not because the artist made a mistake, but because every artist sees the world through a slightly different window. That's the magic of art. And here at Capulera Studios, that's what we explore. Because when you sit quietly with a canvas long enough, characters don't just stay on the page. They begin to step forward, almost as if they're waiting for the artist to invite them back into the world. So today, let's take a small journey through imagination and watch what happens when three legendary characters begin to emerge from the mind of an artist. When an artist begins to paint characters like these, something interesting happens. At first, it's only shapes, simple lines, blocks of color, suggestions of form. Nothing remarkable yet, but slowly, something begins to emerge. A curve in the smile, a glimmer in the eye, a shadow that hints at, shall we say, personality. And suddenly, the character you've seen on screen 100 times begins to feel different, because now it's not the studio's version anymore. It's the artist's interpretation. Captain Jack Sparrow, for example, isn't just a pirate. He's unpredictability. He's the charm of someone who survives not by strength, but by wit, instinct, and a bit of chaos. Painting a character like Jack means capturing that spirit, that playful unpredictability that makes him unforgettable. Then there's Jessica Rabbit, a character that animation history remembers not for only glamour, but for personality. She's elegance mixed with humor, mystery mixed with confidence. Animating or painting a character like Jessica is an exercise in exaggeration. Animators understand something very well. Reality is interesting, but exaggeration is unforgettable. And then we have Davy Jones, a character that almost feels as though he emerged from the darker corners of imagination. Complex textures, stormy emotion, a presence that feels ancient and mysterious. Characters like Davy Jones reminds artists that imagination isn't only bright and cheerful. Sometimes the most fascinating creations come from, let's say, deeper waters. And that's one of the beautiful things about art. Imagination has no single direction. It can be playful like Jack Sparrow, elegant and flirty like Jessica Rabbit, or haunting like Davy Jones. And yet, all of them begin exactly the same way, with an artist quietly placing the first brushstroke on an empty canvas. One of the most beautiful ideas in animation comes from Walt Disney himself. He once asked several artists to paint the same tree, the same subject, the same starting point, but When the paintings were finished, every tree looked different. Some were tall and elegant, some twisted and dramatic, some full of bright life, others quiet and mysterious. And that's when Disney reminded them of something very important. The job of an artist isn't to copy the world exactly how it is. The job of an artist is to show the world how they see it. That idea has guided artists and animators for generations, because art is not just technique. It's perception, it's interpretation, it's the quiet conversation between imagination and observation. And when you paint characters like these, something fascinating happens. You begin to notice things you've never saw before. A tilt of Jack Sparrow's hat, the elegance in Jessica Rabbit's posture, the strange and intricate textures that give Davy Jones that otherworldly presence. These details aren't just copied, they're discovered. Because when artists paint, they're not only creating a character, they're discovering them. Almost like meeting an old friend again, but seeing something new about them for the first time. And that's the one reason animation and character design have always been so magical. Characters may begin as drawings, but in the hands of an artist, they slowly begin to feel alive. There's a quiet moment in every painting when something changes. At first, the canvas feels like a surface. Just paint, just color, just shapes slowly taking form. But then there comes a moment when the character begins to look back at you. Artists know that moment very well. It's the moment when the painting stops feeling like an object and begins to feel like a presence, a personality beginning to emerge. Jack Sparrow's mischievous confidence, or Jessica Rabbit's unmistakable elegance, Davy Jones' mysterious and stormy depth. Each character begins to carry its own energy, and that's what makes a place like Capulera Studio special. Because a studio isn't just a room where paintings are made, it's a place where imagination is given time to breathe. A place where ideas that once existed only in the stories and films can be rediscovered through the eyes of the artist. The studio becomes something more than a workplace. It becomes a place of reflection, a place of curiosity, a place where creativity and quiet observation meet. And when an artist sits long enough with a canvas, characters begin to feel as though they're stepping forward from imagination itself, almost as if they've been waiting patiently for someone to invite them back into this world. And that invitation is the brushstroke. When you spend enough time painting characters, you begin to notice something fascinating. Imagination has many different faces. Some parts of the imagination are playful. They smile and look a little crooked. They walk into danger with a laugh. They seem to dance through the chaos as though life were an adventure. That spirit lives inside of characters like Captain Jack Sparrow. A reminder that creativity isn't always careful. Sometimes it's bold. Sometimes it's unpredictable. Sometimes it's just having the courage to enjoy the adventure. And then there are characters born from elegance and theatrical charm. Characters that almost feel like they belong only on the stage beneath the bright lights. Jessica Rabbit is one of those rare creations where animation and personality, hell, even glamour, meet in perfect harmony. She reminds the artist that style matters, that exaggeration can create beauty, that sometimes imagination chooses drama, color, and confidence as its language. And then there are the deeper waters of creativity, the places where imagination explores mystery, shadows, and ancient stories. Davy Jones feels like he rose from the depths of mythology himself. A character shaped by storms, secrets, and time. Artists often discover that some of the most compelling images come from those darker corners of imagination. Because creativity, like the ocean, contains many depths. Playfulness, elegance, mystery. Three very different expressions, yet all born from the same place. A limitless world inside a mind of an artist. There is a moment in painting that every artist quietly hopes for. It doesn't happen immediately, no. It takes patience, observation, and many small decisions along the way, but eventually, something begins to shift. The eye seems to hold expression. The shadows begin to suggest movement. The posture of the character starts to carry intention. And suddenly the painting no longer feels stiff. Jack Sparrow almost looks as though he might lean forward with a clever remark. Jessica Rabbit seems ready to step beneath the spotlight and steal the scene. Davy Jones appears as though he could rise from the ocean mist itself. Of course we know the canvas is still, but imagination has a curious power. When art is working well, the viewer begins to supply the motion. They begin to imagine the voice, the story, the personality. And that is one of the quiet miracles of animation and character art. A still image becomes something more, because somewhere between the artist's brush and the viewer's imagination, a character begins to live again. And this is why artists continue to paint characters that audiences already know and love, not to copy them, no, but to rediscover them, to see them again through a different lens, through a different hand, through a different imagination. One of the things people don't see when they look at a finished painting is the quiet work that happens between the brushstrokes. Painting characters is not always dramatic. Most of the time it's quiet observation, small adjustments, tiny decisions that slowly guide the image forward. A dark shadow here, a brighter highlight there. Sometimes a line disappears altogether, and another takes its place. It's almost like a conversation between the artist and the canvas. The canvas asks questions, and the artist slowly begins to answer them. This is where patience becomes one of the most important tools an artist has, because characters don't reveal themselves all at once. They emerge gradually. A smile begins to form. An eye begins to carry expression. A shape suddenly feels alive. And when that happens, the artist begins to understand the character a little better. When an artist paints characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, or Davy Jones, they're not only thinking about the character's looks, they're thinking about who that character is. Jack Sparrow carries mischief in the tilt of his head. Jessica Rabbit carries confidence in the rhythm of her posture. Davy Jones carries centuries of storms in the textures of his form. Great animators and character designers have always understood this secret. A character is not just anatomy. A character is personality. Every line on the page must hint at who that character is inside. And that is why character art can feel so alive, because every brushstroke carries a little piece of storytelling. There's something very special about painting characters that audiences already recognize. Characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, and Davy Jones don't just belong to the movies. They belong to memories. The first time someone saw Jack Sparrow sail into the ocean with that crooked smile and unpredictable swagger. The moment Jessica Rabbit stepped into the spotlight and instantly became one of animation's most unforgettable personalities. The first time audiences saw Davy Jones emerge from the misty depths of the sea like a creature from mythology. These characters stay with people. They become part of the imagination. And when an artist chooses to paint them, something interesting happens. The artist isn't just painting a character. They're painting a memory that lives inside of 1,000,000 people. But here's where it becomes magical, because every artist remembers those characters a little differently. Some remember Jack Sparrow's humor. Others remember his cleverness. Some remember the mystery surrounding Davy Jones. Others remember the sadness behind the legend. And when an artist paints these characters, they're really painting a part of the character that stayed with them. That's why every artist's version feels slightly different, because the brush isn't just guided by the hand, it's guided by the memory. And memory is one of imagination's most powerful tools. One of the fascinating differences between painting and animation is time. Animators think in movement. They draw hundreds, sometimes thousands of images that flow together to create life. A character walks, turns their head, smiles, speaks. Every small motion is carefully designed. But painters work a little differently. Painters search for something very specific, not the movement itself, but the movement between the movements. That perfect instance that seems to hold the entire personality of the character. A glance, a smirk, a posture that hints at a story. When you look at Jack Sparrow, you might imagine, well, what he's about to say next. When you see Jessica Rabbit, you might imagine the music that follows her entrance. When you see Davy Jones, you might imagine the storm clouds gathering behind him. That's the magic of character art. A single image can suggest an entire story. And when viewers look at a painting like this, their imagination quietly begins to animate it. The character begins to move again inside the viewer's mind. And in that moment, the painting and the audience become collaborators in the same act of imagination. People often ask artists where imagination comes from. The truth is, inspiration rarely arrives all at once. More often, it appears quietly. Sometimes it comes from the stories we loved when we were younger. A pirate sailing across the screen with a grin that felt completely original. An animated character whose confidence and elegance made the entire room pause. The mysterious figure rising from the dark waters like something from an old legend. Stories like these stay with us. They settle somewhere in the imagination and wait. And years later, when an artist sits in a quiet studio with a blank canvas, those memories begin to surface again. But inspiration also comes from observation. Artists watch the way a light falls on a face, the way posture reveals personality, the way a shadow can change the entire mood of an image. Every little detail becomes part of the creative language, and slowly, all of these influences begin to mix together. Stories, memories, observation, curiosity. This is where imagination begins to build its world. And a studio like Capulera Studios becomes something more than just a workplace. It becomes a place where imagination is given time to gather. Where ideas that once existed only in films, stories, and memories are rediscovered through paint and patience. One of the most fascinating parts of art happens after the painting is finished. Because once the painting leaves the easel, it begins a completely new life in the eyes of the viewer. Every person who looks at a painting brings something different with them. Their memories, their imagination, their own experiences with the characters they've recognized. Someone might look at Jack Sparrow and remember the thrill of an adventure. Someone else might see Jessica Rabbit and remember the magic of animation that first captured their imagination. Another viewer might look at Davy Jones and feel the mystery and drama of old legends and ocean storms. And this is where art becomes something truly special. Because a painting is never experienced exactly the same way twice. The artist may create the image, but the viewer completes the story. Their imagination begins to feel in the movement, the voice, the music, the emotion behind the character. In that moment, the painting becomes more than a picture. It becomes a shared experience between the artist and the viewer. A quiet collaboration of imagination. And that is one of the reasons artists continue to return to characters that people already love, because those characters already live in the viewer's imagination. The painting simply invites them to visit it again. There's a reason artists return to their studios again and again, and it's not always for the finished painting. In fact, the finished piece is often just the final movement before a much longer journey. What artists really return for is the process, the quiet rhythm of the brush against the canvas, the slow discovery of shapes and colors, the peaceful focus that settles in when the outside world becomes silent for a while. Studios have that special atmosphere. They become places where time seems to move a little differently. Ideas that felt distant during the busy hours of the day suddenly feel closer. Characters begin to take shape. Stories begin to whisper through the imagination, and slowly, the artist reconnects with something very simple and very powerful. Curiosity. The same curiosity that artists, animators, and storytellers have followed for generations. It's the curiosity that asks, what would this character look like through my eyes? What expression would they carry? What feeling should the color bring to the scene? And so the artist returns to the canvas again and again, because every painting is another opportunity to explore the endless gallery that lives inside the imagination. One of the curious things about painting is what happens to time. At the beginning of a session, the artist is aware of everything: the clock on the wall, the sound of the room, the little distractions that drift in and out of thought. But after a while, something changes. The artist becomes absorbed in the work. Small details begin to demand attention. The highlight in an eye, the edge of a shadow, the subtle balance between light and color. And before long, hours begin to pass almost unnoticed. And this is one of the quiet joys of creating. Time seems to soften. The outside world fades slightly into the background, and the artists find themselves completely inside the process, inside the colors, inside the characters, inside the imagination. It's these moments that painting feels less like work and more like exploration, because every brushstroke reveals something new. A small expression begins to appear on Jack Sparrow's face. Jessica Rabbit's elegance becomes clearer with every curve of color. Davy Jones gains more depth as shadows and textures begin to settle into place. And little by little, the characters grow more vivid, and the canvas slowly transforms from possibility into presence. As a painting develops, artists sometimes notice something curious. At the beginning, the artist feels completely in control. Every brushstroke is a decision. Every color is carefully chosen. But as the image grows clearer, something begins to shift. The character starts to suggest its own direction. A slight change in expression suddenly feels more natural. A shadow deepens because it seems to belong there. An unexpected highlight appears, and it makes the entire image feel more alive. It's almost like that it feels as though the character is guiding the artist toward its final form. This isn't something mystical or mysterious. It's simply the imagination becoming more focused. The artist begins to understand the personality of the character more clearly. Jack Sparrow's mischievous confidence starts to shape the small detail of his expression. Jessica Rabbit's elegance influences the rhythm of the lines and the colors. Davy Jones seems to pull the shadows deeper into the canvas, giving the image that sense of ancient mystery. The artist listens carefully to these small signals, and little by little, the character reveals itself. What began as paint and possibility slowly becomes something much more recognizable. A presence, a personality, a movement captured from a story that millions of people remember. And that is one of the quiet wonders of character art. The artist begins the journey, but the characters help guide the destination. One of the remarkable things about great characters is that they've never truly disappeared. The film may end, the credits may roll, but the characters themselves continue living quietly inside the imagination. That's why artists return to them again and again, not to repeat the story exactly as it was told, but to revisit it, to explore it, to see it again through fresh eyes. Jack Sparrow will always sail somewhere in the imagination. Jessica Rabbit will always step into the spotlight with that unmistakable confidence. And Davy Jones will always seem to rise from the deep waters carrying the weight of old legends. And these characters endure because they were created with personality, with spirit, with a sense of life that audiences recognize instantly. Artists are drawn to that kind of storytelling because when a character is strong enough, it invites new interpretations, new moments, new artistic perspectives. The story continues, not only on the screen, but on the canvas, in sketchbooks, in studios like this one, where imagination quietly keeps those characters alive in new and unexpected ways. And that is one of the reasons art is such a powerful language. It allows stories to travel far beyond the place where they first began. When people begin to learn about art, they often think the most important skill is drawing. But artists eventually discover something much more important: learning to see. Artists learn to notice detail that most people pass without realizing. The way light gently touches one side of the face. The way a shadow adds depth to a single shape. The subtle curve of a smile that gives a character personality. These details may seem small, but together they build the entire illusion. Animators understood this very well. They knew that a character could become unforgettable simply by exaggerating the right details. A tilt of the head, a rhythm of a pose, the energy in a gesture. When artists paint characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, or Davy Jones, they begin paying attention to those details. Jack Sparrow's expression often carries a hint of mischief, as if he knows something the audience doesn't. Jessica Rabbit's posture carries elegance and confidence, almost like she belongs beneath the glow of the stage light. Davy Jones carries the weight of the sea itself, and the textures and the shapes that form his presence. These details may only take a few brushstrokes, but they tell the entire story. And when viewers begin noticing those details, they start seeing the artwork the same way the artist does. Suddenly, the painting becomes more than a picture. It becomes a world of small discoveries, a moment where imagination and observation meet. And once someone learns how to see the world that way, they never quite look at art the same again. One of the most beautiful things about art is that no artist ever truly works alone. Even when the studio is quiet, even when the canvas is blank, the artist is surrounded by generations of imagination. Every storyteller who created unforgettable characters, every animator who studied movement and personality, every painter who discovered new ways to bring life to a simple surface. Their ideas travel forward through time. Artists learn from them. They are inspired by them. And then they add something new to the story. Walt Disney understood this better than most. He believed that artists should never stop observing the world, never stop experimenting, never stop asking what imagination might reveal next. His studios were places where artists explored personality, movement, humor, drama, and wonder. Not just to create drawings, but to create characters that audiences would remember for generations. And that spirit continues anywhere artists gather with curiosity and patience. In animated studios, in small workspaces, in quiet rooms filled with canvases and colors, places like Capulera Studios, where imagination is welcomed, where stories are revisited, where characters that once lived on screens and pages are rediscovered through the eyes of new artists. Because creativity is a tradition that never ends. Each artist adds another brushstroke to a story that has been unfolding for centuries. And the next idea, well, is always just waiting beyond the edge of the canvas. When artists paint well-known characters, an interesting question always appears. Are we copying the character or interpreting the character? At first glance, the difference might seem small, but in the world of art, it's everything. Copying simply repeats what already exists. Interpretation reveals how the artist understands what they see. We've touched on this before. Every painter brings their own rhythm to the brush, their own sense of color, their own sensitivity to the expression and form. And those small differences quietly transform the image. Jack Sparrow might carry a slightly different spark of mischief. Jessica Rabbit might hold the different balance of elegance and mystery, and Davy Jones, well, might feel even deeper and more dramatic as the shadows settle into place. And these changes are not mistakes. They are the signature of the artist. They are the moment when the character becomes part of a new created voice. This is something Walt Disney encouraged strongly in his studios. He wanted artists to study characters deeply, but he also wanted them to bring something personal to the work. Because imagination thrives when artists are allowed to see things in their own way. That's how creativity continues to grow, not by repeating what came before, but by rediscovering it through new eyes. And every time an artist does that, a familiar character becomes something fresh again. When people look at a finished painting, they usually see the surface, the colors, the shapes, the character that seems to appear in front of them. But every painting carries something invisible behind it. Hours of quiet concentration, small decisions that guided the image one brushstroke at a time, moments where the artist paused, stepped back, and looked again. Sometimes a painting moves quickly. Other times, it asks the artist to slow down and reconsider the direction. A shadow becomes deeper. A highlight becomes softer. A detail that seemed unimportant suddenly becomes the key to the entire expression. All of these moments live quietly behind the finished image. They are a part of the invisible world that every artist carries into the studio. Thoughts, memories, observations gathered from years watching how people move, how light falls, how stories unfold. When those experiences meet the canvas, something unique begins to take shape. The painting becomes more of an illusion. It becomes a reflection of the artist's imagination. And slowly, the invisible world behind the canvas begins to reveal itself in color and form. One of the most wonderful things about creativity is that imagination never really runs out. Every time an artist finishes one painting, another idea quietly begins forming, somewhere in the background of thought. Another character, another story, another world waiting to be explored. That's the nature of imagination. It's endless. Stories inspire artists. Artists inspire new stories. And the cycle continues generation after generation. The characters we paint today were once imagined by artists who sat quietly with sketchbooks and ideas, wondering what might appear if they followed their curiosity. Walt Disney often reminded his artists that imagination was like a frontier, a place where there is always something new waiting to be discovered, not something that could ever truly be finished. And that's the idea that has guided artists for decades, because creativity is not about reaching a final destination. It's about continuing the journey. Each canvas becomes another step forward, another exploration of personality, storytelling, and visual expression. And sometimes along the way, the artist realizes that imagination is one of the few places where there are no limits, only possibilities waiting patiently for someone to explore them. As a painting grows more complete, something very interesting begins to happen. The character starts to show personality. At first, the image may only resemble the character. The shapes are there, the colors are beginning to settle, but the real moment artists wait for is when the personality appears. It often is something very subtle, a tiny adjustment of the eyes, a slight change in the line of the mouth, a shadow that suddenly gives depth to an expression, and all at once, the character feels alive. Jack Sparrow's clever confidence begins to shine through that familiar expression. Jessica Rabbit's elegance and theatrical charm begin to carry their unmistakable presence. Davy Jones starts to feel powerful and mysterious, like a figure pulled from deep sea itself. These moments are quiet victories for the artist. They are the moments when the painting stops being a collection of brushstrokes and begins to feel like a character again. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The audience doesn't just recognize the character, they begin to feel the personality behind it. And that's when art begins to truly connect with people, because personality is what transforms an image into a story. One of the quiet challenges every artist faces is knowing when a painting is finished. At first, it may seem like the answer would be obvious, but in truth, Artists often reach a moment where they could keep working indefinitely. Another highlight could be added, another shadow could be softened, another tiny detail could be explored, and sometimes those small changes improve the painting, but other times they begin to take away from the life that is already there. So artists learn to listen carefully to the painting itself. There comes a moment when the image begins to feel balanced. The personality of the character feels clear. The shapes, colors, the shadows begin working together in harmony. And at that moment, the painting quietly suggests something to the artist. It suggests that the story has been told, that the canvas has revealed what it was meant to reveal. The artist steps back and looks again and recognizes that the character standing on the canvas is ready to meet the world. The moment doesn't always arrive with a dramatic announcement. Often it simply is just a feeling, a quiet understanding that the painting has reached its destination. And that's the artist's role. For now, is complete. When a viewer first encounters a finished painting, something very interesting happens. They don't see the hours that have passed in the studio. They don't see the early brushstrokes that slowly built the image. They don't see the small decisions the artist made along the way. What they see is in the moment, the character, the expression that greets them immediately. Jack Sparrow's familiar spark of cleverness, Jessica Rabbit's unmistakable elegance, Davy Jones' powerful and mysterious presence. In a single glance, the viewer begins to recognize the personality of the character. But something else happens too. The viewer's imagination quietly begins to move. They begin remembering scenes from the stories they loved, moments of adventure, moments of drama, moments of humor and mystery, and suddenly the painting becomes more than an image. It becomes a doorway back into the world where those characters first lived. This is one of the quiet powers of art. A single image can reconnect us with entire stories that have lived in our memory. And when that happens, the painting continues life of those characters in a way we never thought of. One of the most inspiring things about art is that imagination never truly belongs to just one generation. Artists inspire other artists. Stories inspire new storytellers. And characters that were once imagined by one creative mind continue to evolve through visions of many others. Walt Disney believed deeply in this idea. He often spoke about imagination as something that should always continue moving forward. Every new artist brings a different perspective, a different sense of color, a different way of understanding personality and storytelling. And because of that, characters continue to live long after the moment they were first created. They appear in new drawings, new paintings, new interpretations that allow audiences to experience them again in fresh ways. That's the beautiful continuity of creativity. A character that once existed as a sketch on an animator's desk can travel through decades of imagination, through studios, through artists, through audiences who continue to carry those stories forward. And every time an artist revisits one of those characters, they add another small chapter to that ongoing journey. Here at Capulera Studios, the tradition of imagination continues quietly. Each painting becomes a small conversation with the artist who inspired it. A reminder that creativity is not only about what has already been made, but about what might still be discovered. There is an idea in art that has existed for centuries, the idea of the artist's impression. When artists paint something, They are not simply trying to reproduce what already exists. They are expressing how that subject appears through their own imagination. That is what makes art personal. Two artists can look at the same character, the same landscape, the same story, and create two completely different interpretations. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because each artist carries a different set of impressions, different experiences, different instincts. And that's the beauty of the creative expression. And when I paint characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, or Davy Jones, I'm not trying to compete with the original artist who first brought them to life. Those artists already gave the world something extraordinary. What I'm doing here at Capulera Studios is something slightly different with these images. I'm exploring my own impression of those characters, how they appear through my eyes, through my brush, through my imagination that guides my work. And this is something I've always believed strongly about. The most powerful artists often discover their voice not by copying others, but by listening carefully to their own instincts, by allowing curiosity to guide them, by exploring what feels natural in their own creative process. Because when artists rely too heavily on imagination or imitation, their work can lose the very thing that makes art meaningful: individual vision. Great artists study the masters who came before them, but eventually they must step away from imitation and begin discovering what their own imagination wants to say. That is where artistic identity begins, not in repetition, but in exploration. For imagination to truly grow, it needs freedom. Every great artist eventually reaches a moment where they must trust their own instincts, and they must study the work of other artists, and they may admire the masters who came before them, but at some point, they must allow their own imagination to lead the way, because creativity is not something that can be handed down from one person to the other like a formula. No, it grows through exploration, through curiosity, through the courage to experiment and discover what feels true to the artist's own vision. And this is why many artists develop their strongest voice when they begin teaching themselves, when they stop worrying about doing things exactly like someone else would do them and begin asking a different question. What do I see here? What do I feel when I look at this character? How would my imagination bring this moment to life? That is the moment when art begins to feel authentic, because the artist is no longer chasing someone else's style. They are discovering their own, and every artist who's ever created something memorable eventually followed that same path. They trusted their instincts. They allowed curiosity to guide them, and they gave their imagination the freedom to explore without limits. That freedom is what allows art to continue evolving generation after generation. New artists, new ideas, new impressions of characters that audiences already love, and every one of those interpretations become part of a larger story of creativity. Every artist eventually needs a place where imagination is allowed to breathe, a place where curiosity is welcome, a place where ideas are not rushed, and creativity is given the time it needs to unfold. For me, that place is Capulera Studios. This studio is more than just a room with canvases and brushes. It is a place of reflection, a place where characters from stories and films can be revisited through a new perspective, a place where imagination is allowed to wander freely without worrying about rules or expectations. Here, the artist is not trying to repeat what other artists have already done, Instead, the artist is exploring their own impressions, their own interpretations, their own relationship with the characters and stories that have inspired them. And this is the kind of environment where creativity feels alive, where curiosity is the strong part of perfection, where every painting becomes an opportunity to discover something new, a new expression, a new idea, a new way of seeing a character that audiences thought they already knew. And that is the spirit of Capulera Studios, a place where imagination is always welcome, and where every canvas invites the artist to explore a little further. There comes a moment during every painting session when an artist finally steps back, not to add another brushstroke, not to change a color, but simply to observe. From a distance, the canvas tells the full story of a journey. What began as empty space slowly became shapes. Those shapes became expressions. Those expressions became characters that audiences recognize and remember. Jack Sparrow now carries that familiar spark of adventure. Jessica Rabbit holds her unmistakable elegance and theatrical presence. And Davy Jones, well, he stands with the mysterious depth of legends from the sea. 3 characters, 3 very different personalities, yet all of them began in exactly the same place, an empty canvas. Moments like this remind the artist why the process of painting is so fascinating, because what we are really witnessing is imagination becoming visible. Ideas that once existed only in a thought now exist in color and form. And that transformation never stops feeling remarkable, no matter how many paintings an artist creates. Some characters pass quickly through our memories. Others stay with us for a lifetime. The difference often comes down to personality. Characters that carry personality feel almost human. They have charm. They have flaws. They have mystery and emotion. And because of that, audiences connect with them in a very special way. And that is why characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, and Davy Jones continue to inspire artists long after their stories appear on screen. They represent more than a moment in film. They represent imagination at work, the playful spirit of adventure, the theatrical elegance of performance, the mysterious depths of legend and myth. When artists return to characters like these, they are revisiting ideas that audiences already feel connected to, but they are also continuing the creative conversation. Each new interpretation becomes another way of seeing the character, another artistic voice adding something new to the story. That is the living nature of art. Stories travel forward through imagination. Artists rediscover them. Audiences experience them again in fresh ways. And the characters themselves continue their journey through the creative minds that revisit them. After spending this time together here at Capulera Studios, there's something I always hope viewers take away from the experience. Not just the finished paintings, not just the characters themselves, but the process of imagination that brought them into this world. Because when you begin to see art through the eyes of an artist, you begin noticing things that were always there quietly, waiting to be discovered. The balance between the light and the shadow, the subtle expression that gives a character life, the way personality can appear through just a few carefully placed brush strokes. Art becomes less about perfection and more about exploration. It becomes an invitation to look closer, to slow down, to to allow imagination to guide what you see, and perhaps most importantly, to realize that creativity is not served only for studios or galleries. Imagination belongs to everyone. Anyone who is curious enough to observe the world closely and brave enough to express what they see through their own perspective. That is the real magic behind the art. Not just the image that appears on the canvas, but the way it invites us to see the world differently. Art has always been one of the simplest and most powerful invitations in the world. An invitation to imagine. Every painting begins with that quiet moment when an artist looks at an empty canvas and wonders what might appear. Sometimes it becomes a pirate with a mischievous smile. Sometimes a performer whose elegance lights up the stage. Sometimes a mysterious figure rising from the depths of old legends. Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, Davy Jones, three characters that began in the imagination of storytellers and artists who believed that creativity could inspire worlds. And today, here at Capulera Studios, we've taken a small journey through that same tradition of imagination, watching how brushstroke slowly transforms ideas into characters, how personality emerges through colors and form, how familiar stories can rediscover through the eyes of a new artist. That is the beautiful thing about creativity. It never truly ends. Each artist who sits before a canvas continues the conversation that began long before them. And every painting becomes another chapter in the endless story of imagination. So whether you are an artist yourself, or simply someone who enjoys seeing the world through the creative lens, remember that imagination is always waiting. Waiting in quiet studios, waiting in sketchbooks and canvases, waiting in the curiosity that encourages us to ask one simple question: what might it appear if we began? And now, as the studio grows quiet again, well, the paintings, they remain. Three characters standing where there was once only a blank canvas. A pirate who reminds us that adventure begins with a little courage and curiosity. A performer whose elegance shows how imagination can transform personality into art. And a mysterious figure from the deep, reminding us that creativity is not afraid to explore even the darker corners of storytelling. Moments ago, these characters were only possibilities, ideas waiting patiently in the imagination. But through patience, curiosity, and a few hundred thoughtful brushstrokes, they found their way into the world once again. That is the quiet wonder of art. Not simply the finished image, but the journey that allowed imagination to take form. And here at Capulera Studios, that journey continues every time a new canvas is placed on the easel. Every time curiosity asks another question. Every time the artist wonders what story might appear next. Because the world of imagination is never finished. It is always waiting for the next brushstrokes. There is one final piece of the artistic journey that often goes unnoticed: the imagination of the viewer. Because once a painting leaves the artist's hands, it begins living in the imagination of the people who see it. Someone may look at Jack Sparrow and imagine the next adventure waiting just beyond the horizon. Someone else might see Jessica Rabbit and hear the echo of music from an old stage somewhere in the distance. Another viewer might look at Davy Jones and imagine storm clouds gathering above a restless sea. Every viewer brings their own story with them, don't they? Their own memories, their own imagination. And this is where art becomes something truly magical, because the painting is no longer just the artist's creation, is it? It becomes a shared experience, a meeting point between two imaginations, the imagination of the artist and the imagination of the viewer. And in that moment, the character lives again, not just on the canvas, but in the minds of the person who sees it. Art has always been one of the quiet languages of the human imagination. Long before films, long before animation, artists used simple images to tell stories that words alone could not capture. A gesture could suggest courage. A shadow could hint at mystery. A simple expression could reveal an entire personality. At that quiet language continues every time an artist places the paint on the canvas. A brushstroke becomes a sentence. A color becomes an emotion. A composition becomes a story waiting to be discovered. When viewers look at characters like Jack Sparrow or Jessica Rabbit or Davy Jones through the eyes of an artist, they are not seeing a familiar figure. They are seeing how imagination interprets personality, how art transforms stories into visual moments, how creativity allows characters to exist beyond the canvas, beyond the page, and into the living world of the imagination. This is the quiet language that artists and audiences share, a language spoken not through words, but through observation, curiosity, and wonder. And once someone learns to see art this way, they begin noticing that imagination is everywhere, in stories, in characters, in the smallest details of the world around them, waiting patiently for someone to see it. Every artist carries with them an inner world that few people ever get to see directly. A world filled with impressions, memories, ideas that arrive unexpectedly and ask to be explored. When an artist begins a painting, they are opening a small window into that inner world. A canvas becomes a meeting place between thought and form, between imagination and reality. Brushstrokes begin translating feelings and observations into something visible. And slowly, what once existed only as a quiet idea begins to appear before us. That is the remarkable thing about art. It gives shape to imagination. It allows something invisible to become something we can see and share. When characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, or Davy Jones appears on the canvas, they carry more than their familiar personalities. They also carry the impression of the artist who chose to paint them, the artist's interpretation, the artist's curiosity, the artist's sense of wonder about the stories those characters represent. And through that process, something beautiful happens. The imagination of the artist becomes visible, inviting the viewer to step inside that world, if only for a moment. Imagination is a curious thing. The more it is used, the more it grows. Every painting strengthens the artist's ability to see possibilities where others might only see a blank surface. Each brushstroke becomes part of a long conversation between creativity and discovery. Artists learn to trust that process. They learn that even the smallest idea can grow into something surprising if it's given time and attention. A simple sketch can become a character. A character can become a story, and a story can become something that stays with the audience for years. That is how imagination expands. One idea leading to another. One experiment opening the door to something new. Artists understand that this process truly never stops. Every finished painting becomes the starting point for the next question. What else might be explored? What new personality might appear? What other story might reveal itself on the canvas? And in this way, imagination continues to grow with every act of creation, quietly, patiently, waiting for the artist to pick up the brush and discover what comes next. One of the quiet lessons that painting teaches an artist is patience. Great images rarely appear all at once. They reveal themselves slowly, layer by layer, decision by decision. Sometimes the artist must pause, step back, look again. A small adjustment may change the entire feeling of an image. A softer shadow may reveal more personality. A brighter highlight may suddenly bring life to the eyes of the character. These moments cannot be rushed. They require attention, observation, and the willingness to allow the painting to grow at its own pace. In many ways, the painting is not just about creating an image, it is about learning how to see more clearly, how to recognize when something feels balanced, when the character on the canvas begins to feel complete. This quiet patience is something artists come to appreciate deeply, because through patience, imagination has the time it needs to reveal its full expression. And when that happens, the painting feels less like something forced into existence and more like something that was simply waiting to appear. One of the most rewarding parts of creating art is the sense of discovery that appears along the way. Even when an artist begins with a clear idea, the painting often reveals surprises during the process. A color combination that feels more vibrant than expected, a subtle expression that suddenly gives the character more personality, or a texture or shadow that adds depth to the entire composition. These discoveries are part of what makes the creative process so fascinating. The artist may guide the direction of the painting, but the painting itself often reveals new possibilities. This is where curiosity becomes one of the artist's greatest companions, because curiosity encourages exploration. It allows the artist to experiment, to observe, and to follow the ideas that may not have been part of the original plan. And sometimes, those unexpected discoveries become the most memorable parts of the artwork. The moment when the character suddenly feels more alive, more expressive, more connected to the imagination that inspired it. That sense of discovery keeps the artist returning to the canvas again and again, because every painting offers the possibility of finding something new, something that did not exist before the brush first touched the canvas. And that is one of the quiet joys of being an artist to begin with. After spending enough time painting, artists begin to notice something interesting. The way they see the world begins to change. Ordinary moments start revealing small details that once might have gone unnoticed. The way light moves across the surface, the subtle shift of color between shadow and sunlight, the expressions people carry in quiet moments of thought. Artists become observers of these details, and they begin studying the world with curiosity, because every small observation becomes part of their creative language. A tilt of the head, the rhythm of posture, the way emotion can appear through the smallest change in expression. All of these details eventually find their way back into the canvas. And that is why painting is often described as a way of learning to see, not just to look, but to truly observe, to recognize the subtle beauty in shapes, color, and personality. And once someone begins seeing the world through the eyes of an artist, they often discover that inspiration is everywhere, in stories, in people, in the quiet patterns of everyday life, waiting patiently for imagination to notice it. One of the most remarkable things about character art is that a single image can suggest an entire story. A posture can hint at an adventure. An expression can suggest a moment of humor, confidence, or mystery. When audiences look at characters like Jack Sparrow or Jessica Rabbit or Davy Jones, their imagination often fills in the rest. They begin to picture the scenes around the character, the sounds of waves beneath the pirate ship, the glow of the stage lights reflecting on a performer, the distant rumble of thunder across the restless sea. All of these details live quietly inside the viewer's imagination. That is the beauty of visual storytelling. An artist does not need to paint every moment of the story. Sometimes a single frame, a single expression is enough to awaken an entire world in the mind of a viewer. This is something animators have understood for generations. Every character design carries a hint of a story they belong to, a personality waiting to move, speak, or interact with the world around them. And when an artist captures the right moment on canvas, the character seems ready to continue the story beyond the frame itself. People might wonder why an artist would choose 3 characters like this to paint together: a pirate, an animated performer, and a mysterious figure from the depths of the sea. At first glance, they seem like they would belong to completely different worlds. But to an artist, characters like these are fascinating because they represent very different energies. Jack Sparrow is unpredictable. He's movement, mischief, and cleverness. Jessica Rabbit represents elegance and theatrical personality. She's about style, rhythm, and dramatic presence. And Davy Jones carries something completely different: depth, mystery, and a sense of mythology. When an artist paints characters with such different personalities, it becomes a kind of creative exercise. Each character asks for a different approach, different colors, different expressions, different emotional tones. And moving between them focuses the artist to think differently every few minutes, which makes the process both challenging and exciting, because painting characters is not only about how they look, it's about capturing the feeling they carry. One of the fascinating things about storytelling is that some characters fade with time, while others become unforgettable. Characters like Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, and Davy Jones didn't become iconic by accident. They were carefully designed with strong personality. Animators and filmmakers understand that audiences remember characters who feel unique. A distinctive silhouette, a recognizable expression, a personality that feels larger than life. Jack Sparrow walks with that slightly unbalanced swagger and instantly tells you something about him before he even speaks. And Jessica Rabbit carries that elegance in the way she stands, moves, and interacts with the world around her, while Davy Jones feels ancient and mysterious, almost like a legend that existed long before the story began. These elements give the character identity, and identity is what makes them memorable. Artists study these details because they reveal how visual design and storytelling work together. A character is not just a face or a costume. A character is a combination of expression, posture, and attitude and energy. With all of those pieces working together, the character becomes larger than the story itself. And that is when audiences carry them in their imagination long after the film ends. And so, after all the brush strokes, the colors, and the quiet hours spent in the studio, the characters now stand before us. What began as a blank canvas has slowly transformed into 3 very different personalities. A pirate with a spark of adventure in his eyes, a performer whose elegance seems to light the stage wherever she appears, and a mysterious figure who carries both depth and legend of the sea itself. Jack Sparrow, Jessica Rabbit, and Davy Jones. 3 characters from different worlds brought together through the imagination of an artist. But the real story behind the paintings is not just about the image that appears on the canvas. It's the journey that took place while creating it with you. The moments of curiosity, the quiet decisions, the discovery that happens one brushstroke at a time. That is the real magic of art. And here at Capulera Studios, that journey continues with every new canvas placed on the easel. Because imagination is never truly finished. There's always another character, another idea, another story waiting patiently to appear. All it takes is the willingness to begin. And well, my friends, the evening has arrived here at Capulera Studios. The paintings are finished, the canvas is quiet, and these 3 characters now sit together in a place they were never meant to meet. A pirate, a performer, and a legend of the sea. For a little while tonight, they shared the same place, the same space, the same colors, and the same journey. That's one of the wonderful things about art. It lets different worlds cross paths in a way they never thought they could anywhere else. And for an artist, there is something very peaceful about that final moment when the work is done, when you step back and take a breath and simply enjoy what appeared along the way. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for sharing the quiet moments, the colors, the journey of watching these 3 characters come to life. I'm Antonio Capulera, and from all of us here at Capulera Studios, I wish you a wonderful evening. Good night, and I'll see you again at the easel. But before we leave the studio tonight, take one last look at the canvas. It's always interesting to remember not very long ago, this space was completely empty. Just a blank surface waiting patiently for something to happen. And somehow through time, patience, and a little curiosity, 3 very different characters found their way here tonight. Moments like this remind me that art isn't only about skill or technique. Sometimes it's simply about spending time with an idea long enough for it to reveal itself. I hope that while you were watching tonight, you had the chance to slow down for a moment and enjoy the quiet rhythm of creation. Thank you.